Good afternoon, everyone. Could I encourage you, if you're here, to come forward, fill up these closer rows. We do hope to get a conversation going. We have a number of panelists on a series of questions for this 5 Years Out panel, and then we'd like to hear from you. So thank you for coming forward. I'm sorry to report that Sean O'Rourke, who was to be our first panelist, had plane trouble. And I understand, at least a few hours ago, that he was in an airport, but it wasn't the Chicago airport. And so somehow I know he'll get here, but he will not be able to be a part of this session. So that leaves a number of different questions beyond that first one. And the first one we will be dealing with then was question number 2, which is, what are the major themes and contributions of your area over its history? What is the state of the art? And hopefully you realize that there are a number of these 5 Years Out panels for each of the units within NCA, and this is the one for the American Society for the History of Rhetoric, and I'm happy to introduce Richard Graff for this, and Sarah Newman as well.
I'll sit right next. I'll sit right next.
Okay. Richard and I will be discussing the major themes and contributions of our area over its history, and I'm going to start out by talking about the symposium we have had over the years, and then Richard will turn to the advances, our publication. The scholarship produced in our area has illuminated a range of significant themes in the theory, practice, and teaching of the arts of persuasive discourse. Its explicit focus is on the history of rhetoric, as I'm sure all of you know, and since the late 1970s, its members have engaged in projects aimed at the reinterpretation of canonical texts in the Western classical tradition of rhetoric. Increasingly, the research of our members has expanded to the exploration of alternative, historically marginalized traditions of rhetorical theory, practice, and instruction. Since 1977, this scholarship has been presented at Asher-sponsored panels at NCA annual conventions, as we are here now, and during our Society's annual conference meeting at NCA, and our serial publication Advances in the History of Rhetoric. The work of the symposium, as well as all of our work, has embraced over the years the opposing forces of preservation and innovation and continuity and change. And it's those opposites that we are trying to embrace that I will use to discuss the symposium over the years. I'm going to look back 10 years ago in order to look forward 5 years, which is what the panel is going to do, and just look at some of the themes and how we've discussed them over those years. 10 years ago, we looked at the viability of the rhetorical tradition, touching on such issues as disciplinarity, historiography, preserving canons, and civic education. And that, I think, is a good starting point for thinking about what we have covered at the symposium in terms of preservation, innovation, continuity, and change. The next year, we returned to that discussion of the viability of the tradition by considering the future of the rhetorical tradition. So we looked back 1 year, and the next year we looked forward to the viability, to the future of the tradition, asking, is there a necessity for preserving or reconstructing a new canon of ancient rhetoric? From that point, looking at the broader tradition, looking back at the viability in the future, in 2000, when we looked at style, asking if we could understand it as something other than the traditional understanding as mere ornament, and whether we could look at it in ways which embraced other understandings. So to those ends, we looked at style in terms of traditions of pedagogy, memory, and argument, other ways of looking at it other than the traditional understanding. In 2005, after looking at one canon style, we turned to performance in the history of rhetoric, display, spectacle, persuasion, and power, which seems to me to be talking about delivery. So from a broad understanding, we looked at two canons over a couple of years, style and then delivery, to see, in the case of display, to look at performance in terms of cognate fields and in terms of different historical periods and cultural contexts. So someone spoke on ancient Sumer, and we looked once again at pedagogy. We looked at performance in the spiritual, performance in American history, and in those ways, once again, it seems that we looked at preservation and innovation, continuity and change. After that kind of inspection or examination of two of the canons that tend to be marginalized, to see if we could bring them forward, in 2007, for example, we looked at within the very notion of revolution itself, and our theme then was rhetoric and revolution. We looked at revolution, at how it informs traditional concerns with, once again, pedagogy, politics, as well as aesthetics. And taking that kind of tact, I think we embraced a broader perspective once again. In 2008, we looked at rhetoric, cognition, and culture, which was an attempt to innovate the field, I think, by looking at some of the broader cognate fields we look at. And we study, but always have been considered outside the scope of rhetoric. And this upcoming year, I think it's a nice sort of return back over a course of 10 years that started with the viability of the tradition. Our next symposium will look at rhetorics of reason and restraint, Stoic speech from antiquity to the present, but it will look at restraint once again from ancient times to the present, looking at Wollstonecraft and Lincoln, public discourse, and that kind of thing. I'd also like to add that this symposium represents an innovation because we'll be presenting it at RSA. Probably everyone here knows it's not being presented, or wasn't presented yesterday at the day before. So that in itself...
Where was it?
Yeah, where were we? Oops. That itself represents an innovation which we can talk about in what ways it's continuity and change or innovation as well as preservation. So at this point, I'll not go on any longer and turn the podium over to Richard.
Thanks. Sarah just gave a rundown about 10 years back of symposia themes, pointed out some trends, I suppose, in the work that align with some of those themes that under which the symposia are offered. Should note in that context too the presence of keynote speakers that are often drawn from outside Asher's ranks, certainly outside NCA ranks, to be invited into this society for a day and then stay around for a little while, and which they have done, and that's been wonderful, sort of interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary infusion, and their work and the work of members then appearing in the regularly in the Society's annual Advances in the History of Rhetoric, and that's really what I want to talk about now in terms of the contribution of the Society is a scholarly one that's in the form of publication, and in fact the journal it's about 10 years. I think it's going into volume 11 right now. And it's sort of had two periods of existence, and I thought it was interesting to. I've been reading back a little bit. I've been as a Life member or whatever. I think I've been receiving it since about volume 3, and then got the back issues too at one point. And so I've always read it with great interest, even when I've seen the papers. They might have been a conference paper I had attended, but it's changed a good deal. And there's this break in the middle period, a change of editorship and format. And I thought it'd be interesting to just read a few words about to illustrate this distinction. And gets at some of the points about continuity, change, innovation, and preservation that are themes that we are touching on here. There is, David, the first 6 volumes of the journal were collected, which was a slim volume, annual volume, recently collected together for greater accessibility in this beautifully produced one from Parlor Press. Co-edited David Beard there, and then the journal's editor for those years, Rich Enos. And in the preface of this piece, Rich writes, the early years of advances are best characterized as a rhetorical response to our discipline's need to advance in 3 respects. First, we felt that a journal provided a tangible resource that would complement the objectives of our annually presented conference papers. The journal made rhetoric visible in a real sense. And to that end, at that time, all Asher conference papers were eligible for consideration in advances. And the result was overwhelming, as he goes on to say. Second, advances provided a rhetorical solution to another critical need, a place for developing historians of rhetoric to publish their research. So it's developing younger scholars' work in the first publication venue. And one of the reasons for the, slimness of those volumes, too, was they did try to, capture, they didn't ask much more development than the positioned presentation in conference format. So they weren't very long or extensive in that way. Third, we also encouraged diversity of methods, disciplinary perspectives, and research procedures. This emphasis on diversity helped to overcome one of the major constraints in our field, the belief that historical topics must employ traditional research methods. And I think that's that idea of a willingness to, or an openness to different research methodologies or perspectives, different conceptions of history, as well as a pretty flexible conception of rhetoric and its history has been maintained. And today, the editorial policy, I'm going to speak more specifics in a moment, but today I would note the editorial policy. The scope of the advances in the history of rhetoric includes, among other subjects, the following matters of historical research: rhetorical theory, rhetorical discourse, rhetorical criticism, rhetorical instruction in writing and speaking, relations of rhetoric with other disciplines or cultural institutions, processes, and events. And when you line up those 5 matters that it might publish, you get some overlappings there. Rhetorical instruction in writing and speaking speaks to an idea of interdisciplinarity there. And it's something I should point out. Through its long affiliation with NCA, and I'm not too sure when the trend started or if it was an intention of the founders of the society in its origin, there's been not just the keynote specialist in classical rhetoric from the field of classics coming in, but a good representation from non-communication historians of rhetoric, and they've often published in the journal and attended conferences regularly, getting them sort of a virtual membership or exposure with the communication field. And I think that's been a pretty good service and interesting for lots of reasons, cross-disciplinary discussions, and so on. At this point, with the more recent issues since Robert Gaines took over as editor, the format, as many of you are aware, features kind of distinct sections. It's been envisioned this way as conventional articles, the argumentatio section, and then a disputatio once in a while occurs where it might be a focused discussion, debate about a particular issue among maybe between 2 scholars, in addition to collocutio, often with guest editorship on special, say, panels that have been offered in NCA slots. And those are sometimes honorary type things, and I think that's a really valuable thing to preserve in this format for the society. Thomas Sloan, upon his retirement, gets a special session, and there's those papers, those remarks are presented in publication. A look back at Donald Bryant's work was another theme, and several articles on that. But the final part is an interesting one, and probably the riskiest of them, and that is this translatio unit, which has been a regular fixture. Translations of heretofore untranslated works from the history of rhetoric. And these, given the understanding of the history of rhetoric and scholarship in it that was articulated in the just editorial policy, it distinguishes it from, say, a comparable entity or a publication venue like Rhetorica in signaling out pedagogy and instruction as one main subject of research, and even rhetorical practice, that is to say, an interest in the presentation of rhetorical works in action and the criticism of that work. It's not just technical history of rhetoric. And this is reflected in the translations. New translations of things from Philodemus in a very technical, traditional way, but also stump speeches from Puerto Rican politicians in the early 20th century. They're risky in some cases. I've noticed that in some cases the reconstruction of a speech that might be presented here requires some justification. It's not a set text at all, and so it's pushing a little bit forward on that. And it's risky to give pages to such a thing. But the point is, it's making, say, Spanish language material accessible to significant historical and rhetorical Spanish language material or Greek language material accessible to English speakers, and makes it new in the same stroke. Translation does that. Now we're confronted with something that hasn't been seen or seen by as many people in the English-speaking community. And from Philodemus to Michael Psellos, a Byzantine scholar and rhetorician, we are glad to present that, and I'm glad to see it in print and regularly featured that way. Keeps it new, keeps it fresh, brings new things to attention. There's a good justification for each case, and then in addition to the regular and ongoing, more conventional types of scholarship that are published. I think I'll end my remarks there, and we should move next. Is it question 3?
Yes, would be question.
I don't know what the question is.
That's you guys.
It's us. Thank you. So David Timmerman and I, Ned O'Gorman, have been charged with projecting outward 5 years down the road and just raising some issues and some goals for the next 5 years. So I'm just going to speak about 2 things, and then David's going to speak about several other things. I want to start with membership. As a membership coordinator, about 4 or 5 years ago, ASHR had about 80 members on the roll. We now have close to 150 members on the roll. So we've seen substantial growth in membership in the last 4 to 5 years, which is very encouraging. Our goal as an organization is to continue for that momentum to continue. In fact, one thing that those of us who are on the steering committee, those of us who are involved in sort of the day-to, or maybe more like month-to-month running of the organization, talk about fairly regularly is how there's lots of folks who benefit from ASHR, either by being slotted on panels at NCA, or submitting articles to advances, or receiving advances, who are not members. And that's still true now, even with 150 members. That's still the case. I can look at the membership roll and I can look at who's participating on panels. So we need to figure out ways to start to get all who are benefiting from ASHR to also be part of sort of the official roles. In part because the organization is going to face some significant financial challenges over the next 5 years. We have relied heavily on subvention for advances from the University of Maryland, and we are very grateful for the way in which that department and that institution has supported ASHR by very much of the costs of the production of the journal. However, that's not going to be the case anymore, as in most places, that kind of money is disappearing. And so we still have a journal to produce, and we need to figure out ways to sustain the journal. And part of that can be continuing to expand our membership roles. We think that there's a lot more potential out there for a greater numbers of dues-paying members for ASHR. So that is a goal. It's one that I and some others are working on, trying to figure out strategize on how to go about that. And so that then connects to the second topic I've been given to talk about, which is the journal. And just to kind of say some very broad things about the journal and its future. The issue of sustainability has come up in a very pronounced way in the last year. Sustainability in two senses. One is the economic sustainability of the journal, which I just talked about. It's a major issue, and it's one that we need to be addressing, and we are addressing. The second is sustainability of editorship, meaning that the workload that Robert Gaines has been bearing since he took over the editorship, and I presume this has been the case with Advances since its beginning, is not reasonable. Professor Gaines has not only functioned as an editor, reviewing articles, sending them out for review, making decisions, these sorts of things, but he produces the journal. I mean, from getting something in the mail to the final thing that goes out, he is overseeing the whole production process. And really every last bit of it. And it's just not reasonable for us as an organization to expect the editor of our journal to take on those kinds of responsibilities. And so we need to figure out new ways, and we are doing very concrete and specific things to try to come up with a new model for editorship for the journal to relieve Professor Gaines of some of the burdens he's been bearing on behalf of the organization in the past number of years. So we have both two kinds of sustainability issues there that we're wrestling with. And without being able to speak to specifics, I can just say that I think we are going to make some real significant progress in that regard in the next year. The other aspect of the journal that we are thinking about is how we can even expand the audience. How we can expand the audience for the journal even more. And so part of that is expanding the membership numbers of the organization, but part of that is services like EBSCO, which again, Professor Gaines spearheaded the effort to get Advances put online. And so it's now available at certain institutions, at least, electronically online. We want to continue to pursue those kinds of initiatives. We also just want to get more people subscribing to Advances, and so part of that is creating more visibility for the journal, getting a greater number of submissions to the journal, making it even a more competitive journal in which to publish. All of those things can enhance the visibility and the number of readers of the journal. We think that there's a real opportunity here. I mean, we have Rhetorica, but Advances is the only U.S.-based, strictly U.S.-based journal devoted strictly to the history of rhetoric. And so we think there's a real opportunity there, and we want to see what we can make of that over the next 5 years.
Okay, so I'm David Timmerman, and I'm going to tag on to what Ned has begun, again looking 5 years forward here to 2014. And ironically, the couple of things that I'm going to talk about have to do with the possibility of Asher, American Society for the History of Rhetoric, making a closer connection with the Rhetoric Society of America than has been the case thus far, and possibly less of a connection with NCA. So we're going to have to note the irony there. But starting about...
Everybody wave to the camera.
Yeah. probably 3 years ago, possibly 4, members of the organization began discussing the possibility of holding our symposium in connection with Rhetoric Society of America's biannual conference. And the reasons for that, I would note 2 in particular. One is a sense that in terms of our intellectual focus, there might be a closer affiliation, a closer intellectual sympathy with the members of RSA than the members of NCA, as NCA has developed over the last 95 years. And so that was a piece of it. The other is the specific individuals within the American Society for the History of Rhetoric, which does span, those individuals span disciplines, principally communication and English, but also other disciplines. But even if we just take those 2, the Communication Association meeting it isn't necessarily on the top of the radar screen for a member of the English, the field of English. And so Rhetoric Society of America has has had that same sort of distribution since its inception as well. And so at the annual meeting last year, our annual business meeting held at NCA last year, we voted to move our the upcoming symposium from this time period, where it normally would have been held, to RSA 2010 in Minneapolis. And so this May, our symposium will be held in connection with RSA. We voted to do that as a pilot test, and so we're going to do that and presumably come back at our annual business meeting next year at NCA and assess what we think of how that went. But the idea really has to do with intellectual and disciplinary affiliation. I will also say that another thing that was very encouraging to us was the reception we received from RSA when we began investigating this. And so that was a warm reception, and so that may signal positive things in that regard. One of the challenges that we face with that is that the Rhetoric Society of America meeting is just every other year, and there's a sense among at least some of our membership that it's important that we continue to have an annual symposium. That's been a highlight of our work together over the years. It's been a unique symposium. It's had characteristics that other academic gatherings don't quite have in the same sort of way, and so we're talking about what that might mean. RSA does have another program every other summer that we might attach on to, but it's not quite the same as their biannual conference. So these are matters of ongoing conversation, and over the next 5 years, my guess would be, in one way or another, we will make some probably, longer-term determinations about that connection between the symposium and NCA or RSA in the next 5 years. Another matter that's, I think, before us and something we're talking about that will be probably determined, at least in a short-term way in the next few years, has to do with our governance structure. And so one of the things that's been clear to us, or become clear to us over the last several years, is that our practice of electing a new president every year, and also a new vice president, while it has certain advantages, it has some significant disadvantages. And 2 have become clear. One is that the ability for each of those new presidents to maintain the consistency with past, organizational history, past work that's gone on is mixed, perhaps due to the particular people involved as the transition takes place. But you're just having someone come in each year, learning the task, learning the job, and then rotating out, and then rotating someone else in. So that's led to some unevenness and a lack of good connection with the past, and also a difficulty in having a clear and consistent and sustained focus in terms of vision for the future, in terms of where the organization is going, and keeping that going in a consistent way. And so what are we talking about? Well, one of the things we're talking about is the possibility of a board that would be put in place over a series of perhaps staggering terms, but over a longer term setup that would be consistent even as the presidents change each year. You might have a board of perhaps some senior scholars, people who've been past presidents of the organization, and others,
that could provide that consistency in terms of institutional history and vision for the future. So that's one thing that we've discussed. Again, this is all still preliminary as well. We'll probably discuss it again at our business meeting here at NCA 2009. But we don't have any, at this moment, we don't have a clear step forward. We just recognize that this has been a need, a weakness, and with the growth in membership and the other things going on with the journal, some of those difficulties have become clear. And so that's also on our plate. And those were the couple of things that I was intending to mention. So does that pass it on to Dave or Chris? Dave.
Okay. If you'll forgive my anxiety and my nervousness, I'm presenting, Chris Bruss and I are presenting together, and Chris is, of course, my colleague at the University of Kansas, where she has led the charge to help people give better presentations. As you'll notice, she's really good, and I'm not. So you'll bear with me. David asked me to reflect on the greatest contributions that Asher might be able to offer the constituency of NCA. And when he asked me the question, I very much received it personally and sort of understood him as asking, Dave, what contributions has Asher made to you? And so if you'll let me just tell a little bit of a personal story, hopefully that'll be a means of kind of reflecting on the potential contributions that Asher might make to other people. I found Asher as a graduate student. I was pursuing my degree at Penn State, and I met Ned. And Ned was a part of Asher because Ned had pursued his his master's degree at the University of Tennessee, where he worked with Janet Atwell, who is, of course, a long-standing member of this organization. And I remember one of those grad school conversations talking to Ned and him telling me, Dave, you just missed a great symposium put on by the American Society for the History of Rhetoric. He told me about a woman who I had not heard of at the time named Danielle Allen, who came and spent a day with graduate students and with our little organization talking with them. And I'm still actually amazed by that. The next year I went, and every year since then I've gone to the symposiums, and it's a really neat thing for graduate students. It was a really neat thing for me as a graduate student. I was never good at the sort of handshaking part of NCA or the networking. I always felt sort of one part awkward when I would do that. And but Asher was different because we would spend a whole day in a small room with scholars from both English and communication, with both senior scholars and junior scholars, and even if there wouldn't be personal conversations, I still left each Asher symposium sort of feeling like I understood the field a little bit better, because I understood the scholarship of one senior scholar better than I didn't before I went. Let me give you one specific example. I don't remember what year it was, but it was while I was a graduate student. The symposium was held, I think, at Emerson College in Boston, and the keynote speaker was Anthony Corbeil, classicist of the first rate at the University of Kansas. And that day, Tony and I didn't talk a whole lot. He gave a talk. I asked a question about Augustine. He answered. We chatted briefly afterwards. And then 5 or 6 years went by. I never saw Tony again until I was a faculty member at the University of Kansas, and I signed up for a grant writing workshop. And when I signed up, I didn't know that it was being led by Tony Corbeil. I walked into the room the first day and saw his unmistakable afro. Yeah. And said, Tony, you probably don't remember me. My name is Dave Tell. And he said, yes, I remember you. We met at the symposium in Boston, and you asked me a question about Augustine. And then later that day, he emailed me and said, by the way, this is the question that you asked me. And he had it in his notes still. And he said, have you ever figured that out? The answer was no. I hadn't figured it out. But that is just sort of, that kind of thing doesn't happen, or at least hasn't happened to me elsewhere at NCA. It seems like Asher has a real potential for graduate students and junior faculty just by putting them in the same room for a day, right? And letting us get to know each other's work in a more extended manner that's not a 75-minute panel. And so in the last few years, I've agreed to serve on the steering committee of Asher just because it did play such a major role in my graduate education in sort of intangible ways. So that's the first thing. That's the first contribution. The next contribution I've already alluded to is just the interdisciplinarity of it. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Asher Symposium might be the only interdisciplinary space here at NCA. Is that true?
Arst.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So at least it's the only place I've found it at NCA. We'll put it that way. And I've become close friends with some junior faculty across the country in English departments who would come to the Asher Symposiums, who would for no other reason come to NCA. And so sort of along with the sort of opportunities to meet people and get to know the discipline in ways that was, for me, only accessible through Asher, the interdisciplinarity has also been a big contribution. And so that's sort of how it's contributed to my own development, and I think there's possibilities for it to work for other people too.
I'm feeling a little bit like that last person when you do a group work activity, the last person to report after everyone else has reported their good ideas. So some of these things that I had to say have been ably handled by my colleagues. When we think about contributions that we make inside and outside of the academy, we've talked about the symposium and advances. One resource that hasn't been mentioned yet is our website. And the website has recently gone through a redesign. It looks very slick. There is a resources page on that website, and I would like to give a nod to David Beard for compiling that resource list. If you are interested in publishing in the history of rhetoric, you can check out that resource page. And I was very surprised to see some of the names of the journals. There were journals I'd never heard of. So again, thank you, David, for that work of compiling. I think there are 24 journals on that list. There are also links to affiliated organizations, related organizations, we've got RSA and Isher. And one other thing on the resource page is resources in rhetoric area, where you can link to sites like Silva Rhetoricae and 18th century studies, some critical thinking sites. So if you have not checked this out already, it's asher.org, www.asher.org. The last contribution, and Dave and I brainstormed on this together. We had 4 contributions. Last contribution that we'll cover is best understood in terms of Asher's intellectual mission. Unlike other units and divisions in NCA, this is the place where you are going to find a commitment to the rhetorical tradition. I think members of Asher are the keepers of the tradition. And when I talk about the tradition, this is not the keepers of some static, monolithic tradition, but rather a lively tradition. I can recall interviewing for my job at Kansas, and one of the faculty members said, "I see you write about Aristotle." He said, "I just have a question about that. How do you find anything new to say about Aristotle?" And I thought that was a very odd question, because there is so much to say about Aristotle, not just Aristotle. That's what I work on, but we're learning all sorts of things about rhetoric in China and rhetoric in India and rhetoric in the Byzantine era. The tradition is this rich source of problems and models and exemplars. It's a long tradition. There are good reasons to study it, and Asher gives us a space to present our work on the tradition. That's very important. I've discovered, and I'll bet you've run across this too, cases in which the tradition is appropriated, and it might be inaccurate, or maybe oversimplified, or maybe it's neglected altogether. So it's a good thing that we have folks in NCA who are focused on the tradition, who keep doing that work and making sure that the tradition is a viable object of study. I also think that Asher, focused as it is on the tradition, can be a useful voice in curricular and pedagogical discussions. I saw a great panel today on the intersection between rhetoric and pedagogy. And for anyone who is associated with the discipline of English, this seems like old news, kind of old hat stuff. But in communication studies, that intersection has been neglected. And it was just great to see this panel from the University of Memphis. These students who were excited about this intersection between rhetoric and pedagogy, and they said, we have such a long tradition as a teaching discipline, and we've got this new course at Memphis on rhetoric and pedagogy. That's great. And you know what? We in Asher, I would hope 5 years out, would continue to provide space for those kind of panels. And my interest in this is a little bit selfish. I'm a basic course director, and as such, I go to sessions with the basic course division and instructional communication, and I've learned quickly that the concerns there are very different from the ones that I have as a historian of rhetoric. There, the focuses are very on the ground, pragmatic, administrative, but where do we talk about the curriculum, the pedagogy, and what the tradition can offer? And I think that's where Asher can play a very important role. So I hope we continue to do that. This last point is a little bit fanciful, so bear with me. I think Asher members, again, as keepers of the tradition, can illuminate current rhetorical practice. And I'm going to give you an example of this. Some of you know Dr. Katja Haskins, and you might be aware that she was interviewed a few months ago by BBC News to comment on the power of Barack Obama's oratory. Now, Dr. Haskins, of course, works in different units and divisions, but as a past Asher president, a current member of the steering committee, I'd like to claim her as our own and say this was an Asher member who was commenting on this. She said, his speeches are shaded with subtle echoes of great speeches past, consciously creating a sense of history, purpose, and continuity. Now, isn't that spoken like a true student of the rhetorical tradition? I say, well done, Dr. Haskins. And 5 years out, this is my vision, that when we're watching some of these talking heads on TV, that instead of Michael Beschloss, we see Dr. Haskins, or maybe anybody in this room. So more commentary from Asher, because we're equipped to do that. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all our panelists, and now we'd like to hear from you and on anything that's been mentioned or anything that comes to your mind as you think about Asher moving over the next 5 years to the 100th anniversary. So we're open for questions, comments, etc. David.
I wonder if you can speak to the effort to develop a division within NCA devoted to the history of rhetoric, and in a kind of mournful way, does moving the pre-conference from NCA hurt the chances of ever building enough members of Asher to constitute the critical mass to form a division?
Someone up here may know more about this than I do. Actually, my understanding was that as we got the materials ready for that, NCA changed, put a hold on all applications for divisional status, and that's where that is.
Yeah, and as far as moving the symposium, I too initially was worried about that, but I don't think that moving the symposium is going to hurt our chances. It's really just a matter of numbers. At least it was. That's the way MCA had done it. So it was a matter of just accumulating enough signatures to make the case to NCA to include us, create a history rhetoric division. And we had those signatures. We had to go outside of our membership at NCA to get some of those signatures. We all have colleagues and people who are sort of tangentially interested in the history of rhetoric, but maybe are not involved with ASHR. But nevertheless, they were willing to sign. And so, I think that will continue, even if we were to move our home base elsewhere. I think that we can find enough people here at NCA, and who are interested enough in the history of rhetoric to move this division forward. So, it's still on the radar.
Yeah, can you hear me all right like this? I'll say another thing about that. Let me just do this. I've been involved on and off in those discussions since they started, and the other issue there is that to become a division entails a certain organizational structure, which you could say is a a shadow of the Asher, and you sort of mimic it here, but there's other responsibilities in being legislative counsel and all these sort of things. So I've always worried about stretching our people power pretty thin in terms of leadership to be able to do both, sustain our activities with the membership numbers we have as Asher and then as a division. That concern might not be pressing on other people, but it's been one for me. And as a panel, I would just say that the way that the NCA set up these 5 years out, it was what is your area contributing and so on, and we took it mostly Asher as an organization, not I think students of the history of rhetoric, but rather Asher. So that's the way I understood the charge anyway.
So some of this connects to leadership issues, which we need to be thinking about over the next 5 years, structural issues. I mean, he's speaking as a past president of ASHR, and it's exhausting. And so to try to think about another responsibility for such a person at this point is a little overwhelming. So we need to figure out how we can divide the labor better.
Mm-hmm.
When you talked about the biennial, going every 2 years with RSA, I really enjoyed the RSA Institute that Richard and Deborah Hahi led this past year, and was wondering, is there some way that could become sort of an institution, that there's some sort of historical ASHR offering at the Institute every year? That would seem to give continuity, and most of you, I think, mentioned graduate students or building younger scholars as a main focus. That it fits with what you said here.
Does. That's a very good point.
The answer to that question is yes.
So you're looking the wrong direction.
If I were you, I would do it when the current president of RSA was the founding president of this organization.
Right. That's right. That's right.
You're not allowed to find more sympathetic.
That's right. Yeah.
Supporter.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when David spoke of RSA's warm reception of ASHR, it's largely Michael Left's warm reception.
That's
so
really
thank
not
you.
entirely true. That it was well received by everyone, welcomed by the whole board. So it's seen as a salutary thing for RSA.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a difference between viewing it favorably and getting somebody to act on it promptly.
Yeah, Steve.
I just throw this in from somebody who only periodically participates in Asher, coming from a non-communication discipline, comes from English studies. When I heard, this is how periodic my relationship is, when I only heard yesterday that Asher was planning to, at least on a trial basis, participate more with RSA, which I am a member of. I was really, really pleased, and so I thought, okay, this is really great. Now I'm going to be able to participate more in this, and because I only come to NCA when I'm invited to do something, and then I try to participate in Asher. And I actually was looking, because I was invited to do something, and I was looking for Asher, and I couldn't find the Symposium. I didn't know what I thought advantage.
Right.
I thought this was an indication of the hearsay that people who remain nameless but are sitting in front of me have led me to believe of the sort of marginalization of history and theory of rhetoric within the NCA over the years. And just another example of that. So after feeling good about it, then I said, oh, this is really too bad. This is, and so Dave's remark about the division thing, made me think that in fact, if there's still interest in people in NCA to actually increase the participation of people interested in history of rhetoric, except for Richard's point here about the spread too thin, this could actually be an opportunity for, and I love this, history of rhetoric being even more imperialistic and actually growing in two different places that continually interact. If it's just a matter of getting signatures from, if that's one of the criteria for having an Asher division, you're going to increase the chance of getting signatures from those people that are outside of the NCA if you're affiliated with RSA. And it seems to me, so I just want to encourage both of the actions that I heard. One is closer and closer affiliation with the RSA, not only its biannual meetings, but the Institute. And still moving forward with the divisions, and there'll be those of us that are, let's say, fellow travelers with NCA and Rhetoric that would be more than happy to help out in that. And so I hope you end up doing both, because this can bode well for the history of Rhetoric, both outside and inside of the NCA.
Yeah, it's Stephen. My reaction to that is the movement of the Symposium to RSA doesn't mean we have the status of ASHR as an affiliate organization.
Right.
The reason in 1977. I speak without fear. The reason that the affiliate status idea came about was that we were not able to get history of rhetoric programs through the existing structure. That history of rhetoric programs were not viewed with favor by the reviewers in other areas. But if we became an affiliate organization, that guaranteed us X number of programs at the convention. And so that was the reason. And that would not change. Now, so by working as an affiliate organization, we would still be able to preserve the kinds of programs that we've had at this conference. Moving to a divisional unit entails a different kind of problem that Richard talked about, a different kind of administrative responsibility. And somebody would have to step forward and say, or some group, that they would take responsibility for that. It includes sitting on the legislative council. Now, there's one thing worse than having to sit on the legislative council. It's having to sit on the legislative council twice. It really involves a terrible toll in terms of dealing with the awkward politics of the NCA. But if it were possible, it would be fine. But I don't think that we're jeopardized by remaining an affiliate organization with or without support.
One of the things that surprised me this last year as we went through the submission, call for papers, taking in the papers, reviewing the papers, and then finalizing them. So we, Asher currently has 16 or 17 panels, and that's high. It's one of the higher numbers. So of all the different units in NCA, we're really actually one of the ones that has one of the higher numbers of devoted panels. That speaks to this question, and we had plenty of submissions again this year. In fact, one of the things that happened was in the way that papers and panels were reviewed by the reviewers that I enlisted to do the work, a panel of some well-regarded and well-deserving senior scholars was not accepted. It was ranked lower than a number of others, and some of these are my good friends, and I got phone calls, and they were not too happy about their panel not having been accepted. But it just speaks to this issue of we have plenty of panels here at NCA currently, and we have plenty of submissions. We have a competitive. It was a competitive situation where even in one case, a panel that I think would have been an excellent panel was ranked significantly, lower. It wasn't even a borderline case, and I had to tell my good friend this. Anyway, I don't think I'll get a Christmas card this year. But so I think that speaks to this, Michael, in that we have a relatively high number of slots, panel slots here at NCA, and we have. At least this year that I did it, we had a high number of submissions to get into those slots. I wouldn't think that would just drop off,
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we need to be careful about if we do pursue a divisional status is if those numbers would suddenly get disrupted in some way, or if if there's different criteria applied to affiliates versus, and so we do need to watch that. Because you're right, I was just at the planners meeting yesterday because I'm planning for next. We're in the top third numbers. Now that means we're way behind some divisions. Like some have, a couple of them have like 45 slots. But we have for next year, and they're cutting back on everybody's for next year. We have 15 slots. The preponderance of divisions have under 10 in the single digits. So I was surprised.
What's the current status of the journal?
We're current. I don't know what exactly I can define current. This journal, the journal we are looking. We have a publication committee that has been formed, that has been communicating with each other for the last 6 months, very deliberately about the future of the journal, and we have several significant tasks. One of them is, as I said. Financial viability, sustainability, and that includes all the production issues that come with the journal. And then the second is, again, going to the editorship thing. That how do we create a sustainable model for editorship? And so we've made a lot of headway. It would be premature to in this space to kind of say this is where we're at, because we haven't signed on the dotted line with anything yet. But I think David and I are both on this committee, and I think we both feel really good about what's been happening over the last 6 months. Deborah Haughey has been chair of that publication committee and has been doing an outstanding job in leading us and thinking about the future of the journal. So right now, it's still in Robert Gaines' hands, and we're glad it's there, and he is trying to push out Volume 11, and we're going to have to fork out a lot of cash from the what money we have as an organization, because Maryland has said they're not going to subvent it, so we got to deal with that short-term issue, and then we got to think about longer-term issues. I don't know if Michael, that gets.
So Bob's doing one more issue, and that's it. Is that it?
That's probably the most likely scenario. Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably the most likely scenario. So we probably are going to be looking for another editor.
Well, our camera person said if we put this in about an hour time frame, you would be happy. So looks like we've done that.
Yeah, 7 minutes is bad.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.